So hi everyone, welcome to another of our monthly How to Heal Our Divide book discussions. Thanks for joining us. I'll let Bethany introduce our moderator and our guest book contributor in a moment, but I did want to spend just a little bit of time to share with you our new cover. Here we go. So as you probably all know by now, we're going to be coming out with a second How to Heal Our Divides book. Our target release date is May 24th. And so if you want to be part of the launch team and you want to be part of the book launch party on May 23rd, please go to the How to Heal Our Divides website and go to the tab that says launch team, and you can join the launch team and find out about everything else there. But in any event, the second book is going to be similar in construct to the first book, in that it will have about 27, I think it is, individual chapters, each written by a different contributor. Only one of those authors is someone that also contributed to the first book, which is Shannon Crossbear. All the rest of the book two contributors are new. So I'm very happy about that, and very happy as always to be sharing about all these wonderful organizations that are doing great work in healing different types of divides. So I won't, spill the beans any further than that yet to tell you who some of the contributors are, but I hope you'll be happy with the group that we've assembled. So anyway, just wanted to share that with you. Does anybody have any questions at this point? I probably couldn't answer them anyway, so too early. But anyway, thanks for all of your support for the entire effort, and thanks, Bethany, for allowing me to share this. So let me stop the share. Okay.
I like the cover.
Good,
Yeah,
wonderful.
good. Like the title too. Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm so glad to see everyone today. Welcome. This is our second session in the How to Heal Our Divides series. And today we'll be talking with Marva Smith, and she will be in conversation with K Scarry about her chapter contribution in the book. I'd like to introduce Kay. I'm sorry, Marva will introduce Kay. I'm going to introduce Marva. Marva Smith is a management and leadership consultant, work and life coach, and the author of the best-selling book, Time to Thrive, A Busy Woman's Devotional Journal. She's also the contributing author of She Writes for Him, a Black Voices of Wisdom, an award-winning book featuring 21 Black women, Christian women. Marva is passionate about equipping, inspiring, and empowering women to thrive beyond the 9-to-5 so that they can fully live with purpose and passion. She starts her day with coffee and her Bible while soaking in the view from her hilltop veranda. She lives in the British Isles with her husband and 2 children. And if you'd like to connect with Marva, you can contact her at www.marvasmith.com. And with that, Marva, I'd like to welcome you. Thank you for being with us today.
Yes, thank you so much, Bethany. I am thrilled to be here with everyone. And yes, I am joining you from over in the Caribbean. I'm here on an island called Tortola. It's in the British Virgin Islands, and I'm just thrilled to be here with you. And to start off by introducing our speaker, really, who I will be interviewing, so to speak, which is K Scarry. K, it's a pleasure to have you. Allow me a minute to please introduce her and share a little bit about her with you. Kay is the community director of the People's Supper. We'll hear more about that in a minute, I'm sure. And she is driven by a conviction that people should have consistent space where they are welcomed in. Kay launched an open community meal in her hometown a few years ago that's still going strong. She has worked in a number of nonprofit organizations, exploring different manifestations of community, with women coming out of sex trafficking, in a fraternity house, as an associate pastor, and as a chaplain in a maximum security women's prison. She holds a Master's of Divinity from Wesley Theological Seminary. And in her spare time, whatever little spare time she has after she's doing all of that, you can find her either journaling or doing the Cupid Shuffle, Kay. Two of her favorite things to do. So Kay, welcome, welcome, welcome. It's so good to have you here with us today.
Thank you. It's so good to be here. I'm looking forward to being in conversation with all of you.
Awesome. Well, one of the things I'd like to have you do, because I'm mindful that some persons may not have read the book or may not have read your chapter of How to Heal Our Divides. So if you can start by giving us some context, what is your chapter about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work for an organization called the People's Supper, and we do work all over the country with communities facing moments of rupture or who don't know how to move through things that threaten to divide us for all different reasons. And so we kind of anchor our work around the question, what is it that needs healing here? How do we create the conditions for trust building that allow folks to connect, to know one another more deeply, and then to be moved together towards social action? So in my chapter, I talk about a lot about some work we did in Erie, Pennsylvania. In 2017, Erie was named the worst place in the country for African Americans to live, 2018, by a study done by USA Today. So they brought the People's Supper in to kind of help them think through how to both do the kind of relational healing work, but also how to do the work of story collection. How do we take a national issue of racial inequity and injustice and anchor our solutions in the local? And how do we do the work of knowing how that issue is impacting our residents here and then mobilize our residents to be able to create solutions alongside one another? So my chapter talks a little bit about that process and some of the things we learned along the way.
Well, good, because I think today we'll be able to explore a little bit more in depth. As you know, you mentioned the chapter goes into some details, but perhaps as we might have questions from the floor, we can entertain some of those as well. So I'd invite everyone, if you have questions, to put them in the chat. I believe Bethanie is monitoring the chat, and then at some stage we'll be able to take those questions and do our best to answer them. So I thank you for giving us that backdrop. And you mentioned that question, what needs healing here?
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that is such a powerful question. How have you seen that play out in the work that you do?
Yeah, something I feel proud of about the People's Supper is we've shifted a number of it. We've always been focused on polarization in its many forms. We've shifted how we've understood what that looks like throughout the years. So we started after the 2016 election and we're really focusing on political polarization. But by 2018, we realized that political polarization in the abstract wasn't really enough to propel people to show up to connect. It was much more, what's the acute pain point I'm feeling in my particular place? And we think about it sometimes as like an X factor. What's the thing that really people are feeling really acutely? And so, you know, that could be a really local issue. There's a community that we've worked with that was having arguments about policies about four-wheelers and ATVs. And that was like the thing that they needed help moving through. And that, or it could be like we had a gathering after the Kavanaugh hearing in 2018 where people were seeing kind of those proceedings play out and felt we need different ways to move through this. And I'm noticing that as I watch this play out, I'm feeling some animosity towards my family or my neighbors who might think differently from me because my conviction about this is so strong. And so sometimes it's the national things that people feel really acutely. We had a similar kind of, after George Floyd was murdered, there was we were called into a lot of communities who were like, oh, right, this is in our neighborhood too, and we don't know how to move through it. Sometimes it's much more locally based, but really thinking about, I sometimes reframe the question for folks too as what's the thing that keeps us in our neighborhoods, in our communities from creating a shared future that works for all of us? What's the thing that gets in the way? What's the thing that we don't know how to talk about that we need to be able to dig into together if we're going to be a real community with one another?
Yeah. I mean, I live in a small community, as you can imagine. And what I find is that regardless of the size of your community, you will always have issues.
Yeah.
You will always have things that can potentially divide. And as you mentioned, the various types of polarization, you know, there's so many, right? There's so many. Obviously, this book discussion is based on, you know, looking at racial divides and how we can heal. But certainly there are other divides that we find at play. You mentioned one earlier, and I believe that was how the whole People's Supper got started. which was political polarization
Yeah.
after the 2016 elections. I know you weren't a part of People's Supper at that time, but I have a feeling that you were not immune to the polarization that was happening. Maybe you can fill us in as to how you were feeling during that time.
Yeah, so I feel like I have a particular story about the 2016 election time. I've always really loved gathering with people for meals, and I've always really liked the idea of creating kind of communal spaces of belonging. And so in spring of 2016, I had launched an open community meal in my home, and I just invited people out and about. And so it was often strangers. It was people that would come over for dinner that I didn't necessarily know. And we called it Tuesday night dinner. It was every Tuesday night. And that meant that one of our Tuesday night dinners fell on the night of the 2016 election. And a group of strangers walked into my home, and I live right outside Washington, D.C. So there's a whole other, we're sitting with certainly the election in and of itself. It's also, we all know people who are going to lose their job regardless of who wins. So there's those layers here too. And into my home walk a group of strangers, some of whom were wearing I'm with her t-shirts, some whom were wearing MAGA hats. And I just had this moment of like everything we've been taught, or I've been taught, I should say, is you can't really go there with each other until you have some sort of relationship. But here we were, a group of strangers who were very obviously in different places on a very particular night coming over for dinner. And so it was kind of a crash course for me. And how do you facilitate a moment like this? How do you, and I kind of led with some leveling about that. Like, hey, I'm feeling the tension as everyone walks in, and I'm wondering what it might mean for us to have dinner together. Can we figure out a way? Are we going to look at the results? Are we going to wait? Can we figure out a way that we're going to? And so we decided as a group to wait until 9 p.m. Dinner started at 7, and then we'd all look at the results together, but we put away our phones ahead of time. And before that, we had kind of a moment of reckoning with someone in the room is going to be disappointed, and it could have been you if you're the one who wasn't. And so that's kind of how we moved through that. But it was a real springboard for me about, oh, whoa, like, how do you actually do this? And what do you do when there was a person in the room whose job was on the line, depending on who would win the election? And how do you start to peel back the layers of how deeply personal this is? It's not just about who you want to win. It's the deep, deep layers of someone's sense of personhood and well-being and security. And how do you honor that and witness that and create spaces where folks can see and honor that in each other, such that we might move through those tension points together.
Yeah, well, what a way to address the elephant in the room.
I was not ready. I did not really think through this possibility, but like I said, it was a crash course.
Yeah, and also you're very brave for having, a Tuesday night dinner in your home, and anyone can come, and you just don't know who's going to show up, so hats off to you. That's the first thing. But maybe we can talk about some practical tips, because how to heal our divides really is about the practicals. How do we move forward, and what does that look like? So the People's Supper offers a possible way. Mm-hmm. So if we were to say, you know what, I've seen some divides in my community, I want to do something about it, where do I start?
Yeah. I'll say we have some resources online that will walk through kind of start to finish, how do you do this thing, but I'll explain about what that looks like for us here as well. I think the first question is really getting clear on who you're trying to get, on what you're trying to move through, and therefore who needs to be in the room and who can't be in the room. So if we're doing a gathering about racial divides, then we don't, if it's going to be a mixed race group, we won't welcome folks who can't acknowledge that racism is real and present in the United States. I think that's one of the myths of the bridging space, is this idea that these are spaces you can have anybody come. And actually, we see this as like one part of the many things that need to happen for communities to heal. And so thinking really intentionally about the work of harm reduction as you kind of create your invite list really matters. We have kind of layers of discernment we'll do with communities too around where are their power dynamics here? What's language that resonates? What are the values that will resonate with your community? In my town, we feel really proud about being this like small town in a larger in a big area. And people who know each other as neighbors. And so that's language I might lean on if I'm going to invite my neighbors over. We say that we're people who know each other and that we have that small town feel. This is a chance for us to live into that value. So thinking about kind of those things, thinking about who you already know. We also think a lot about if you're looking at gathering folks across identity or ideological difference, you don't really need to know everybody you're going to invite. You just need to know a couple of folks who might be connected to the people you want to be in the room. So we think about kind of creating a host committee of sorts. So if I'm doing work on political divides, I might have a host committee of a couple of Republicans, a couple of Democrats, and each of them are then required to invite 10 people or however many.
Okay.
We think about kind of the way the People Supper model works is we break people down into groups of 8 to 10 with a peer trained facilitator participant. And so we move people through like a 45-minute training on what do you do actually in the moment when the conversation's happening. And so much of that is what you named, is to name the elephant in the room, to kind of preempt the things that might get in our way. If I'm gathering a group of church people, I know that I have to say, hey, your minister's in the room, but today they're gathering with you as a person. And so we're inviting them to take off their minister hat. We're inviting you to take off your way of seeing them as minister and not as fellow person. And so, we think a lot about kind of, and most of the time when you articulate that, people get that. And so helping people think through what they already know about their community and then leaning into those things to tell the community then the truth about them as we invite them into a space like this is a really helpful place to start.
Yeah. Yeah, I stopped in my tracks when you mentioned knowing who you're going to invite and who can't be in the room.
Yeah.
Because in my thinking of the People's Supper or just having a gathering like this is that you invite everyone, whoever
Mhm.
wants to come, right?
Yeah.
But what I heard you say is you need to also have some boundaries around this.
Mhm.
And how does that work, Kay? How does that play out?
Yeah, well, I think you're like most people and like me before I started really getting into this work is like, right, can't this be where anyone can come? But really realizing that some people's perspective could cause incredible harm in this space, depending on what you're trying to gather around. So thinking about, if I want to have a conversation about racism where I can invite anybody, I might actually break out into racial affinity groups where instead of having a mixed race group, if there's somebody who's a naysayer about race, a white person in my neighborhood who's a total naysayer about race as an issue that's real and live and well in America today, I might then invite them to an all-white space to kind of unpack together, because then their comments aren't going to land on the bodies of people where that's going to do even more harm. So thinking about those dynamics really make a difference, and to be able to level with folks. Sometimes it's not so much this is who we can and can't invite, and then there's the level that's like, I want to be able to invite this person, but I've got to have a conversation ahead of time about what we're going to expect, how we're going to boundary their participation. And I think a lot about kind of depersonalizing that by narrating for people, hey, I've seen you show up in this way before. If you're going to do it here, you can expect me to respond in these ways. So much of what I think about that makes conversation really hard across ideological or identity difference around some of these tension points is if there's a moment of tension, it's like we have such a hard time knowing how to deal with that moment of tension because there's such a reaction of like panic or now I'm being personally called out. And as much as you can kind of mitigate that and preempt some of that such that you can just deal with the tension moment. That's a lot of what I think about too, is it's the preparation of the people way before they get in the room. It's being able to tell people, some of this is who we can't welcome into a space like this allows me to tell folks in an invite moment, hey, this is how we've thought about this. This is who will and won't be in the room. If I'm asking you to show up and be vulnerable, you can trust that I've done the work to make sure that you're going to be well held here.
Mm-hmm.
That's a little rambly, but I hope it was clear.
Yeah, no, but this is why I love to break it down, because I think we all have good intentions, but sometimes we get stopped in our tracks by figuring out the how.
Totally.
And so I personally want to figure out the how. And you mentioned facilitators. So there's a resource guide which can walk us through some of these steps. And it will also give us some tips as to how to be a facilitator in the room.
Yeah. Yeah. And we are in the process of building like an online, of facilitation video that folks will be able to just access online. It's not quite finished, but should be in the next couple of months. But we think a lot about the role of the facilitator as they're also a participant and they're also a peer. And those things feel really important. We're inviting folks within their own community. We're not bringing in people who don't know the texture and intimacies of all that might show up in the community space. Those are people who pose questions. We kind of think about questions. We usually pick 3 for a people supper gathering that we think about questions that anyone can answer that allow for varying degrees of vulnerability that kind of get us to the issue at hand and the stories that often propel us to show up in the ways we do in conversations like this, but maybe aren't the ones we're apt to share. So a facilitator we think about as the person who introduces the questions and who can kind of keep the conversation on track. So mindfulness about if someone's dominating the conversation, how do you bring them back? It's a complicated thing because the facilitator ends up being a person with a lot of power in the conversation as much as we try to for that to not be the case. And we try to name that too, like it matters that when you're in a breakout room or in a small group at a table that people have someone to look to, but we try to name like they're also participants and we invite all of you to be co-creators of the conversation. They're just going to be posing some questions and able to kind of keep us on task if we need it. So one thing that we've shifted is we've started inviting all the participants to a facilitator training so that we kind of give everybody the skills of interrupting harmful rhetoric, bringing people back in, keeping people on track. And that's been a really helpful shift too, that if we can kind of teach people, everybody in the room, how to move through moments like this, it takes away the kind of power of the facilitator such that the conversation can sometimes get a little bit deeper.
And it also builds ownership because if I'm in the space, if I'm at the table, I also have a responsibility.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So I remember you mentioned in the book about it's sort of like the case study of Erie, Pennsylvania, and the work that the People's Supper was doing there.
Mm-hmm.
And I also recall that the mayor was not at the table, right? So these conversations were going on. And maybe you can kind of give us, again, that sort of backdrop for those who may not know about that. So tell us how that worked with bringing people together. Why was that even important? And how can we use that as a model moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, Erie was named by USA Today does a study every year about the, yes, Brian, I see your question. I can do that. I will do that. USA Today does a study every year about the worst places in the country for African Americans to live. I'll say that I don't know all the details of how they arrive at that conclusion. I do know that it doesn't include social experience, so that's worth naming. Erie was named the worst in, I believe I said 2017 earlier. It was actually 2018, so I apologize for that. And the mayor, that was their kind of acute moment of like, we have a problem. We need to do something.
Yeah.
And I appreciated that the mayor was like, instead of just like pulling together the usual suspects to come up with a litany of solutions, how do we actually dig into what this feels like for our residents? How do we actually understand what this means for the people of Erie? And how do we empower and mobilize the people of Erie to be the drivers of the solutions we create? So they called us in, and it was an exciting place for me to kind of begin to play with the relationship between trust building and policy change. So we gathered 80 participants from across Erie who all had 20 each of African Americans and the Latinx community and white folks and new immigrants to Erie. And those 20 of each group were across kind of 5 different sectors of Erie. So business, education, arts and culture, things like that. And we moved them through a series of 5 conversations to kind of really unpack what's it actually like to live in Erie from our different identities. And we tasked them also with kind of bringing the questions we were using out to the neighborhoods they were in and the communities that they touched, so that we needed it to be a contained group, but we wanted to bring in the voices of others across Erie. At the end of the series, we led them through a design thinking exercise to surface, based on everything we've heard, the stories we've collected, how do we then prioritize what changes need to happen at within our government? What systems change has to happen here? And so those 80 came up with 10 possible ideas to make Erie more equitable. Things like a promise scholarship for Erie public school students to make sure that everyone would have access to higher education. Things like a cultural competency training that all public works employees would have to go through. Things like birth to boardroom training for HR professionals about cultural competency, and things like different curriculums for the schools about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And then we brought in more people to kind of be part of bringing those ideas to life. The mayor had committed before the series began to taking on whatever these participants came up with, which was a really powerful relinquishing of his power. The mayor's staff were in the room, but at their own table going through the same questions. So they were still exploring those things, but they weren't at the tables with residents as to not sway the conversation in a particular way. But they were there for the kind of hearing of, we had a chance at the end of every gathering for folks to say, this is what we want the mayor to hear about what came up at our table. So there were chances for that to happen. It was a really powerful example of kind of how we do this. What does it actually look like to just feel the urgency and to do the relational work that builds the foundation to make this so. So the last thing I'll say about it, I know we've been talking about it for a long time, is of those participants that went through our People Supper series in Erie, they became the kind of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Council to the mayor's staff. So now they counsel the mayor on all kinds of issues of anti-racism and equity, diversity, and inclusion in the community. And they're the ones who work with the mayor to bring all those ideas to life as well. And so it really mattered that we had those months of trust building, because as they're now doing the building of these changes and programs, there's so much that threatens that work if we don't have the deep relational ties to help us move through the moments where that work gets incredibly hard.
Yeah, I think that was a powerful way to demonstrate commitment to doing the work, because, you know, just even with the mayor's commitment of whatever comes out of these sessions, I'm going to, you know, think forward, I'm going to move forward with them.
Yeah.
That was a lot of trust right there in the beginning.
Yeah.
You know, he was very brave, but then he backed it up.
Yeah.
He backed it up. And that's what building trust looks like. You know, you can say all the nice things, all the, you know, things you think people want to hear, but until you're able to demonstrate, you know, that there is a willingness to move forward, you know, that really affects it. I saw that Brian did have a question. If you want to go back and address that now, that's fine.
Yeah, so Brian asked in the chat if I could say a bit more about the resource guide we have. So we have a couple of guidebooks online that are really kind of start to finish, how do you do this type of work? We have one that's really centered on these racial justice journeys, as we call them. So a similar kind of type of process that we did in Erie. And how do you do them when you don't have a local government leader who's kind of driving them or committing to taking on whatever action surfaces. So basically they talk about, again, start to finish, how do you even get clear on what you're trying to gather around, what the dynamics in the room are, who you need to invite, who you need to not invite, how do you do the inviting when people get in the room, like how do you prep people for getting in the room when they get there, how do you what questions should you ask? How do you move through when a hard moment shows up? And so our guidebooks really kind of move through. We feel like we work hard to kind of brain dump everything that we've learned. And for us, we think a lot about, we don't want to bottleneck this. We think this type of work is important for folks all over the country to have access to. We've had the privilege of being able to be in this for so many years, and it's our sole focus. And so we've been able to learn things that have required time and practice to learn. And so those resource guides are really our way of sharing those learnings so others don't have to learn the hard way, and so that people can be able to use the things that we've been learning as they might apply to their own communities.
I see we have another question as well, Kay. So perhaps I'll read it out for you if you don't mind. It says, Kay, are you familiar with nonviolent communication? Instead of protecting others from contrary remarks or ideas, how about bringing in some information that enables people to communicate nonviolently, even when there is controversy or disagreements? And there's a link there as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think, and I appreciate the question because it makes me wonder if I if I didn't communicate in the way I intended, which is I certainly think that done well, conflict is an invitation for greater intimacy, that there's a real chance for deep relationship building and trust building in moments of conflict. And so absolutely, we draw on practices like this of how do we create the conditions where things like this can surface, where the controversial thing or the hard thing can be surfaced in a way that we are prepared and we know how to be able to deal with it together. And so I wonder, I might be projecting, but I wonder if the question is from like, who doesn't get to be in the room? I think about those being people who don't have that openness. It's not so much about what their perspective might be. It might be about their unwillingness to examine their own perspective as possibly being a limited one, or that more than the particulars of what their perspective is, if that makes sense. But thank you for that.
Yeah, yeah. And please, if you have any more questions from the floor, continue to put them in the chat, or you may have some time at the end, Bethany, to unmute persons' mics and have them say a word or two. But I'm definitely enjoying this conversation. I want to turn things a little bit around, Kay, and talk about your own personal experiences, because I know that you mentioned that you've been called a bridge builder.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, I sense a sort of a burden of responsibility. And so I want you to speak a little bit about that. What does it mean to be a bridge builder and to bear that title, not one that you've put upon yourself, but that others have actually given to you? How does that weigh on you?
Yeah, it feels complicated. I feel like yeah, I wrestle with the term, I think for a couple of reasons. One is I do, back to what you said earlier, Marva, about trust isn't just feeling good about one another and being friends with one another. It's backed by action, by change. And I do think that there's something about, I wonder about I'm sure I can run with the metaphor of a bridge as having supports and beams and, being, but I think that so often bridge building as a term in the United States is seen as we help people be nice to one another and be friends with one another. And I think that that's valuable. Like I appreciate a world where people are nice to one another, but I really think the work is we help communities do the work of knowing one another enough that it propels them to different ways of being together and to then being committed to doing the structural work of change. That matters so much. And I think that can get lost in how bridge building has been understood in the United States over the last few years, especially. I think it's often been reduced. And again, this is a great thing, but it's just not all encompassing of what I think this type of work requires. I think it can be reduced to like the articles before Thanksgiving about like how you have the conversation at the dinner table with your uncle, where it's like not awkward, but you really know that you think the other one's totally wrong. And to me, it's so much more than that. I also think for me that like the burden of the work is to constantly sit in nuance, and to constantly be discerning what it means to, how do you hold people accountable? How do you think about the work of accountability and belonging? And when those things come in tension, how do you do the work of honoring people's dignity when there are people who are doing harm? I mean, there's just so much of when do we justify not moving to action quick enough? When are we rushing to action? When actually trust building, like relational trust building is the thing that has to happen. I think all of those, there's so much nuance. There's so much about, it's so personalized to each community, each individual. And I feel sometimes like I want to be able, if I'm really honest, like I want to just be able to be annoyed at my neighbor when I think they're doing something ridiculous. And like, this work has taught me that there's always a deeper story. And that is the greatest, such a good gift. Like I feel such gratitude for my knowing of that in my bones. And some days I'm exhausted and I want to just be able to disengage. And so learning to be well in the work my own self too has been a journey, certainly.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I see Therese has put something in the chat, a link for us to check out later on. Thank you for that. But also back to the bridge building as well. Yeah, I can sense that it does feel heavy. And as you talk about a bridge and the structural support, there needs to be that, right? Even for the individual who is doing the work
Yeah.
and bringing people together. And because of the polarization, helping us to see that there is a middle ground. And I don't know that it requires a sort of a, for us to do away with our feelings.
No.
You can be annoyed. You
Yeah.
can feel the pain. You can feel the hurt. But it's
Absolutely.
what do you do with it? I think about going back to scripture, the scripture that says, in your anger, do not sin. It doesn't say don't get angry.
Yeah,
It's what you do with that anger,
absolutely.
right? So I just want us to be mindful, even as we have these conversations, that we are in no way saying to people that you just need to, again, Kate, going back to just be kind, just, can we all just get along? There's more to it than that. And the bridge building is an important aspect. But also, just like in Corinthians, where it talks about, Apollos is, he has one role and I'm Paul, I have another role, but we can all work together towards this common purpose. So we need the bridge builders. We need, other players in the space as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Is there some advice you have for the person who falls into that role as bridge builder for how you can take care of yourself as you do this work? How do you do it, Kate?
Yeah. Well, I've got my people that I can be really honest with about the ways that it can be so hard and the ways that the other piece to me that makes it hard is it's such a slow work and necessarily so, but I sometimes wish I could move quicker. And so, I have my people who are my deepest community, who know intimately the things that make this work complicated for me and who know also the values that propel me to show up here and who can kind of remind me of that and tether me to that on the days that it's really discouraging and I can't see anything but discouragement. That feels really important. I think kind of my own, tethering myself to a community of other people in this type of work who are also wrestling with the questions that it surfaces has made a huge difference. And I have like things all over my desk that remind me of my own values, that kind of remind me of why I show up to this work every day. And that has made a difference to me too. I'm also a journaler, so it helps me to I know in my body when I need to just disengage for a second and write it all out and wrestle with a question or a tension point or a problem set and make some sense about ways forward and trusting my own knowing in my body about what I'm needing has also been a learning for me.
Awesome. So I've heard you need to have your people and journaling helps, just trusting what you're going through and being able to have that support around you as well.
Yeah.
Let me take a look at that question that came in. So, hi, Kay. Thank you for your work with communities. Will you speak about the work in the women's prison? I'm embarking on working with this community.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So when I was in seminary, I was a chaplain in Georgia, there are 4,000 female inmates, and of them, there are 80 who are classified as high-level mental health. And so as the chaplain to that group of 80, the kind of high-level mental health, maximum security female inmates in Georgia. Talk about a profound space of learning a deeper story, of being the person who could sit and bear witness. And I felt really aware that my role was one that I could humanize in a system that was constantly dehumanizing. And so I spent most of my time just sitting with women. Something that was important to me too, that I think parallels this as well, is letting people have ownership over their own stories. That's some of what shows up in the bridge building world a ton, is letting people use the language that feels resonant with them and the stories they want to tell matters. And so one commitment that I had made, that I articulated to the women I worked with, was that I wouldn't look up any of their crimes. And so I became the only person that they interacted with who didn't know why they were there. And that if they wanted to tell me, they could tell me, but I still haven't looked them up. I still don't know why a number of them were there. And that mattered, because it matters to give people agency back to their own story and experience. And again, I think about that in the People's Supper work. We do a lot of we sink into people's own story sharing. But yeah, I worked there for a year. I did visits, I sat in the common room and anyone who wanted to come visit with me could. And then I did visits every day in solitary confinement for women who wouldn't have folks otherwise. And that was, yeah, a really profound learning of the deeper story, and really a huge condemnation, I would say, on our system and the way that we discard folks. And so many of them hadn't been set up to be able to flourish. And so this is a consequence of that. And so, yeah, I loved that work. I loved it so much. I'm excited that you're going to be there too. It's important.
Yeah. Okay, I was wondering, I know at the base level, you realize that getting people from different sides together would result in positive outcomes, but what was something that was surprising to you, something you didn't expect, or maybe even roadblocks that you kind of hit in this process?
Yeah, I think as much as I knew ahead of time how many layers and how complicated the work would be, you don't know it until you're in it. I'm constantly coming up against new, oh, but here's the tension point here. Oh, but here's what makes it harder here. And that, really knowing that has been a surprise and has been new in a lot of ways. Yeah, even learning, I think I also came into the work thinking that political polarization was one of the main issues, but I'm finding in communities a lot that it's usually, again, a deeper thing, and that politics exacerbates the other stuff underneath, that the ways we already didn't know how to be in the right relationship with one another, the ways we already didn't have rituals and practices of moving through conflict together. Our political landscape makes those things so much more emphasized and accelerates some of the rupture, I think, but I don't often think it's actually about politics themselves. I also think that how often people come to the work, and even my own, so I think the two other things I'll say about it. One is, another place of surprise is how much self-work it requires of me. You kind of start in the bridging world, I'm really good at relationships, and so I know how to do this, let me teach other people. And the work of really examining my own bias, my own ways that it's hard for me to show up matters so much. And the continued peeling back of layers of that in my own self has also been a surprise, if I'm honest. And we hear it all the time. People come to the work thinking this is where I can fix my relatives that I struggle with. I'm coming to this place because they're the problem. And that's the other thing too. I think the surprise of how much we aren't in practice of being able to see the value in differing perspectives. So often people come to places like this thinking, to bridging spaces, and think, if I can just get them to see why my perspective is right, we'll be fine. But there's not really this we don't really have great practices for there's gems in your perspective and limits to your perspective, and there's gems in my perspective and limits to my perspective. And together we might have a more full way of moving forward if we can honor that. I think that piece, learning how to get people into really believing that and embodying that such that we can build together has also been a hard work that I think that the nuance of that is something that I hadn't quite been able to language before. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Kay. Mm-hmm. So as we start to bring this sort of full circle, I wanted to ask, thank you, Finley, for being here. So I wanted to ask about an update on the work that the People's Supper is doing. So it's been about a year since How to Heal Our Divides has come out, and I'm sure that you've been working on a lot of projects since that time. So maybe you can give us an update. What are some of the new and exciting things that you're doing?
Yeah, a couple. So one piece of work I'm really excited about, we've been working with the Baltimore Washington Conference of the United Methodist Church. And we did a series last year with them that kind of paralleled our series in Erie, like a racial justice journey, but it wasn't so much to build towards policy change. It was a lot about leadership development. How do we build people in the practice of doing this type of work such that they might take it home to their congregations? Now we're in kind of a phase 2 of that, where we're peeling back our work and teaching people, a cohort of people, how to be equipped to lead congregations in doing this when they have hard things that they need help moving through. That feels really exciting. This kind of cohort of folks who we're really being able to kind of dig deep with on how do you actually do this? How do you teach? How do you be the people that can teach other communities to do this? Feels really exciting. And so the cohort we're meeting through the spring, and then by June, they'll all be in like a 1-year term, that when there are issues that come to the conference's attention that are happening in congregations that they just cannot solve on their own, this cohort of people will be kind of called in to use the People's Supper model to help them move through those issues. And that feels really exciting to me. Our sister project is the dinner party. And so the dinner party is an org that connects folks in their 20s, 30s, and early 40s who've experienced a significant loss. So another thing that we're really working on this year is like, how do we kind of consolidate our learnings from each to be able to do the work of, right, how does grief show up in the bridging space? How do we think about our work as kind of dealing with, it's not so much just about grief, it's about the isolation of that experience, and how do we see how much isolation and fragmentation are hand in hand, and consolidate our learnings from each of those bodies of work to be able to do different types of work with communities. So we're right in the thick of asking some of those questions internally. So I don't have a great idea of where that's going. I have some thoughts that are mostly mine, not necessarily the org, but I feel really excited about that conversation of the role that isolation plays and grief in the work of combating fragmentation. And so I'm hopeful about what might come from there.
Yeah, it sounds exciting.
Yeah, I feel excited about it. So it's good.
You know, I as I think about what has happened in the last year, I mean, we can't think about the time that we're in without thinking about the pandemic and how that has affected community and even the conversations that were happening before and that still need to happen. And as a matter of fact, I feel like one of the polarizations has been, you know, we see the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated and the discussions that are happening there, and a lot of pain coming out from that. But what then? How do we continue to build those communities and have those discussions in light of social distancing and pandemic and issues from, you know, different points of view on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I have been surprised, I think, I really love a meal with people. And so I've been very surprised at how rich a Zoom conversation can be. One of our guidebooks is about how to do this work in the age of social distancing. And so there's a lot of, you have to facilitate differently. When I can't make eye contact with you across the table, I have to think differently about how to acknowledge your presence or to cue to you that I've really heard the thing you've just shared. And so that's one layer, I think, is really thinking about kind of how do you facilitate differently in a Zoom space to still create the conditions of belonging and people feeling heard. The other thing I'll say is we worked throughout 2020 with the Brooklyn Borough President's Office, and we kind of initially thought they might be a next Erie in some ways, but we realized when we were kind of doing our layers of discernment with them, again, I see the People's Supper as like one piece of the larger organism. There's kind of all these needs for different types of work to be done to heal divides, if you will. And so whereas Erie was like a really huge feedback mechanism for the local government, in Brooklyn, they already had those mechanisms. What they didn't have were like neighborliness. And so we did center our work on positive points of social connection. And so it was much more lighthearted, much more kind of combating the isolation of COVID-19. How do we give people chances to remember that this person is also a grandmother and who like bakes cookies for the PTA. You know, like there's something about, I feel like COVID-19 has helped us realize that as much as we love the work of trust building and social change, and I stand by that 100%, it also matters to have just positive points of social connection with your neighbors. And so that's become another layer of kind of our discernment with communities is what it looks like to when that's actually the necessary thing for a community that's in a lot of pain or that feels really isolated. And how do we create the conditions that allow that to also be people's experience?
Yeah, the conversation needs to continue. Whether we're on Zoom or we're in person across the table from each other, we still need to have those conversations.
Absolutely.
And speaking of that then, Kay, how then do persons get in touch with you and with the People's Supper if we want to continue this conversation and start our own People's Supper organization table setting? How do we do that?
Yeah, I just chatted in at thepeoplessupper.org. My email is K, it's just the letter, at thedinnerparty.org, which is confusing, but but you can find me there. If you on the People's Supper website, there's a a contact form that I will read too. And then we have a resources page there that includes all those books I mentioned earlier, but I would be so happy to be in touch.
Awesome. I want to share this quote that I saw at the heading of the website, the People's Supper. It says, social change moves at the speed of relationships, and relationships move at the speed of trust. It's very powerful, and I think it's a fitting way for us to bring this discussion to almost a close, because I still want to see if there are any other questions around the table. If there's anything that Kate touched on that you want to explore a little bit further, and if there's any way that you want us to support you in the process of healing divides. So Bethanie, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you, Kate. I'm still on the call. As we have questions, we'd be happy to entertain them.
Hey, thank you so much. Are there any other questions that we need to delve into a little bit deeper as we try to be these amateur People's Supper holders in healing our divides? I want to thank you all for attending. Thank you, Kay, for sharing and helping us to see how we might come together in these unprecedented times. You've heard that word a lot. And thank you, Marva, for your great moderating and just kind of digging into this chapter. Thank you so much for your contribution to the book, and for Brian for caring so much about this topic and a next book that we can continue to learn from. So we will meet again next month on May 5th at noon with Roger Hutchinson and Catherine Meeks. And we just look forward to continuing to go through the book, How to Heal Our Divides. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great day.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.